The door came open hard, and the cold came in with it. Two men stood in the frame of Ruth Brannigan's front entrance, shoulders braced against the October wind, and between them hung a third man, the way a fence post hangs between two others when the ground is given out beneath it. His arms were draped across their shoulders. His boot heels dragged shallow lines in the floorboards as they pulled him through, and the sound of it, that slow scraping of leather on wood, was the only sound in the room for several seconds. Clara Whitfield was laying the supper table. Her hands stopped. Not because she was frightened. She had seen injured men before. Her mother had taught her the way frontier mothers taught most things, not from books, but from necessity. What stopped her hands was the silence of the man between those two shoulders. Drunk men protested when they were carried. They cursed. They made opinions known about the indignity of it. This man was silent in the particular way of someone whose body had already made every decision there was to make and left his mind with nothing left to manage. He was tall, even sagging, dark-haired, unshaved for a week at least. His face had been worked on by weather and time, but neither had left a clear record of how long. He could have been 35, he could have been 50, and Clara, standing there with a fork still in one hand and a folded napkin in the other, could not have said which. There was a wound along his left side. His shirt had torn away from it, and someone had tied a neckerchief over the opening, knotted too loose to do much good. The cloth was dark, not from the fabric, from what had soaked through it. Ruth Brannigan appeared from the kitchen. She looked once at the man, once at the blood, and turned to Clara. "Room 3, she said. Nothing more was needed. Clara set the fork down. She crossed the room. She did not hurry, but she did not hesitate either. And later she would think about that, about how her body had known what to do before her mind had finished deciding whether to do it. She washed her hands. She brought clean water, clean cloth, the small leather kit her mother had left her that smelled of camphor and lavender and a life that no longer existed. She sat beside the bed in room 3 and she began to work. The wound was not a tear. It was not from a fall or a fence or the careless edge of a tool. Clara had seen enough of those to know the difference. This was a bullet wound, entry clean around, smaller than a fingertip. The kind of hole that a rifle makes at distance when the shooter is far enough away to aim, but close enough to mean it. She did not say this aloud. She did not mention it to Ruth. She simply noted it the way she noted everything, quietly, completely, and filed it in the place where she kept things she had not yet decided what to do with. What surprised her was his hands. She was cleaning the wound. It hurt. She knew it hurt because she understood the mechanics of what she was doing. The pressure, the contact with raw tissue, the unavoidable cost of making something clean before it could begin to heal. Most men gripped something when they were in pain, a bedpost, a fistful, a blanket, their own knee. She had seen it enough times to expect it. Emmett Calloway's hands lay open at his sides, palms up, fingers loose, as though he had made a long and private agreement with pain some time ago and saw no reason to renegotiate it now. He stared at the ceiling above him and breathed slowly, deliberately, through whatever the cleaning cost him. "This will need several days to close properly," Clara told him. Her voice was even, professional in the way of someone who had no profession but had learned the manner anyway. "I know," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. "Is there family I should send word to?" A pause followed, not the pause of a man searching for an answer, the pause of a man deciding exactly how much of an answer to offer. "No," he said. Clara finished the dressing. She washed her hands in the basin by the window, dried them on the cloth she kept folded over her shoulder, and left him to sleep. But she stood in the hallway outside room 3 a moment longer than the task required. Her hand rested on the doorframe. The lamp at the end of the hall threw her shadow long and thin against the opposite wall. That pause of his, that single word, it had not sounded like a simple answer. It had sounded like a door being pulled shut, carefully, quietly, but deliberately closed against whatever was on the other side. She did not know this man's story. She did not know where he had come from, or what had put a bullet in his side, or why a man that calm under pain had no one in the world to notify. But she had heard something in that silence, something that lived underneath the word no, the way a current lives underneath still water. And standing there in the dim hallway with the wind pressing against the walls of the boarding house, Clara Whitfield realized she had noticed. and that noticing that quiet pull of attention towards something she could not yet name was the most awake she had felt in 6 weeks. Because 6 weeks ago, everything had been different. And 6 weeks ago was where this story actually began. 6 weeks earlier, early September 1887, the train pulled into Sagebrush Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon under a sky so wide and pale, it looked like the world had forgotten to put a ceiling on. Clara Whitfield stepped down from the last passenger car with a single trunk, a hat the wind immediately disrespected, and a letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft along the fold lines. The letter was from a man named Lyle Muir. She had never met him. She had answered his advertisement in a Missouri newspaper. And over the course of 4 months and 11 letters, she had come to believe that she knew him. He described himself as steady, hardworking, a man building a life in the Wyoming Territory who wanted a wife who understood that frontier living asked more than it gave back. A real house, he had written in the third letter, the one she kept closest, with a proper kitchen and a porch that faces the morning sun. She had believed every word of it. Lyle Muir was not at the station. He was not at the post office either, or the general store, or anywhere along the short stretch of packed dirt that served as a main street in this town. Clara stood on the platform and waited. An hour passed, then another. The station master, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and an expression that belonged to someone who had delivered bad news enough times to have developed a technique for it, finally approached her. Lyle Muir had left Sagebrush Crossing nearly 3 weeks prior. No forwarding address, no word left behind for anyone. Least of all for the woman he had written to, courted through letters and sent a train ticket. The station master paused before he turned to go, a hesitation that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but somewhere in between. He left in a hurry, he said. His eyes moved briefly to the left, the way eyes move when a person is deciding whether to say more, like he was avoiding someone. Then he went back inside, and Clara was alone on the platform. She did not cry. She had learned early in her life that crying required an audience willing to be moved by it, and the station master had already closed his door. She stood there and watched the train pull away, its smoke trailing west across the valley floor, and she had the strange and specific thought that it was taking the last reasonable version of her future with it. Her mother had died when Claire was 19. Lung sickness, the kind that came with winter and simply never left. Her father had followed 2 years later, not from illness, but from the particular exhaustion that takes hold of a person when the one they loved most is no longer there to make the effort worthwhile. He had not fought it. He had simply stopped holding on. The small inheritance they left behind went to practical things: rent, food, fabric for clothes she sewed herself, and finally the train ticket, the last thing she bought with hope rather than necessity. Now she stood in a town she had never seen, in a territory she had never visited, with 12 cents in her pocket and a trunk full of clothes sewn for a rancher's wife. And the man who had promised her a porch facing the morning sun had vanished like smoke in a strong wind. Clara picked up her trunk, she settled her hat against the wind, and she walked toward town. Sagebrush Crossing was the kind of place that looked temporary even from a distance. A handful of buildings clustered at the base of a long valley with mountains rising gray and indifferent on 3 sides, and the road running east toward the rail line like a lifeline stretched too thin. The main street was packed dirt rutted from wagon wheels, and it ran for perhaps 200 yards before giving way to open land that did not seem particularly interested in being settled. There was a general store with a false front and a porch that sagged on one side, a post office that shared a wall with a barber shop, a church at the far end of the street, small and white and stubbornly upright against the wind, as though it had decided that faith was a structural principle, and set back slightly from the road with a painted sign that had faded to the color of weak tea, a boarding house. Clara walked the length of Main Street with her trunk bumping against her leg and the wind pushing at her back like an impatient hand. She passed 2 men sitting on the porch of the general store, and they watched her the way men in small towns watch anyone new. Not with hostility, but with the careful assessment of people who have limited resources and want to know whether the newcomer represents an opportunity or a complication. She must have looked like neither. A woman alone carrying everything she owned, wearing clothes that were well made but road-creased, with the particular posture of someone who was holding herself together through force of habit rather than confidence. They looked and then they looked away, which was perhaps the kindest thing they could have done. She found work the same afternoon. Ruth Brannigan ran the only boarding house in Sagebrush Crossing, and she had the particular gift of reading a person's situation without making them feel red. She was a wide woman with strong hands and a permanent squint earned from 12 years of working near a hot stove alone. Her husband had died of malaria a dozen years back, leaving her with the boarding house and three children who had since grown and scattered the way children do when the land they grew up on offers more memory than opportunity. Ruth kept the place going, not because she loved the work, though she did it well, but because it was what she had, and Ruth Brannigan was not the kind of woman who let go of what she had. She looked at Clara standing in her doorway, trunk, hat, dry eyes with tired edges, and she made her offer with the efficiency of a woman who had seen this particular story before. Perhaps not this exact one, but close enough to recognize the shape of it. A small room at the back of the house, 3 meals a day, a modest wage, in exchange for cooking, cleaning, and managing the needs of whoever happened to be staying. Clara accepted without negotiation. You do not negotiate when you have 12 cents and nowhere else to go. You simply say yes and mean it and figure out the rest as you go. In the days that followed, Clara learned the boarding house the way a person learns a piece of music. Not by reading it, but by playing it until your hands remember without being told. She learned that the floorboard outside room 4 creaked, that Mr. Pemberton in room 2 took his coffee without sugar and his pride without question, and that he would rather sit with an empty cup than ask for more. He was 68 years old, courteous in the old-fashioned way that suggested a former life more formal than this one, and he read leather-bound books by lamplight every evening, occasionally writing in a small notebook that he kept close and never left unattended. She learned that the wind came hard from the north just before dawn, and it rattled the kitchen window in a way that sounded if you were still half asleep, almost like someone knocking to be let in. She met Della Pruitt, who ran the general store across the street, and had the gift of knowing everything that happened in Sagebrush Crossing while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to keep people talking to her. Della was 31, quick-smiled, warm-hearted, and the first person in town who spoke to Clara like a friend rather than a stranger. It was Della who told her one afternoon over the counter while Clara was buying salt about Lyle Muir. Muir wasn't the house-building type, honey. Della's voice was light, but her eyes carried more weight than her tone. He owed money all over this town, and he was in and out of Judge Cross's office more times than a man with nothing to hide ought to be. Clara had heard the name Judge Harlan Cross before. Ruth had mentioned him once briefly in the way a person mentions a weather pattern they have learned to live with but do not enjoy. He doesn't rob people, Ruth had said, wiping down the kitchen counter with the deliberate strokes of a woman who cleaned things the way other people prayed. He waits until they are desperate enough to sell. Then he buys at whatever price he wants and calls it helping. Clara filed this away. Cross, Muir, a connection she did not yet understand but could feel the edges of the way you feel the shape of something in a dark room before your eyes adjust. The work at the boarding house was honest and the days were full, and Clara told herself that was enough. Most mornings she believed it. But what she had not resolved, what lived quietly at the back of her mind, the way an unanswered letter sits on a desk, was what came next. She had always believed, perhaps foolishly, that she was meant to stay somewhere, to build something that lasted, to belong to a place the way a tree belongs to its ground, not by force but by root. She had not found that place yet, and at 26, with no family left to return to and no clear road forward, the uncertainty of it sat heavier some evenings than others. She began keeping a journal, not an old habit, something new, something that started in Sagebrush Crossing and belonged only to this chapter of her life. She wrote small observations. The way afternoon light fell across the main street in long amber angles, the way Ruth placed a hand on someone's shoulder without saying a word, and how that single gesture contained more comfort than most people managed with entire sentences. The way the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and wet earth after rain as though the land itself were breathing. She wrote because it made the days feel less like waiting and more like arriving, even if she did not yet know where. There were moments in those early weeks when the loneliness came hard, not the sharp, dramatic kind that announces itself with tears or sleepless nights. The slow kind, the kind that sits beside you at a table set for one and watches you eat without speaking. It came in the evenings, mostly when the boarding house settled into its night sounds and the other guests retreated to their rooms, and Clara was left alone in the kitchen with the dishes and the lamplight, in the particular silence of a woman who has no one in the world expecting her to be anywhere. She learned to manage it the way Ruth managed everything, with work, with routine, with the quiet discipline of putting one task after another between herself and the empty space where a different life should have been. She learned to bake Ruth's bread recipe, which required a patience with rising dough that was, Ruth informed her, a test of character as much as skill. She learned to mend clothing with stitches so small they disappeared into the fabric, a skill her mother had taught her, and that now earned her a few extra coins from the townspeople. She learned the names of the regular customers at Della's store and the particular gossip patterns of Sagebrush Crossing, which moved through the town the way water moves through a dry creek bed, following paths of least resistance and pulling in the low places where people gathered. She learned, most importantly, that she was capable of more than she had given herself credit for, that she could run a kitchen for 8 people without burning the biscuits or losing track of who owed for what, that she could handle Mr. Pemberton's formal courtesy and the occasional difficult guest, and the wind that came through the gaps in the walls with the particular determination of a climate that did not care about human comfort. She was not happy exactly. Happiness seemed like a word that belonged to a different vocabulary, one she had packed away with the clothes meant for a rancher's wife. But she was steady. And steadiness, she was learning, was worth more than happiness in a place like this. Happiness was weather. Steadiness was ground. And then on a Tuesday evening in the middle of October, 2 men carried Emmett Calloway through the front door, and everything changed. In the 3 days that followed that first night, Emmett Calloway said very little and observed a great deal. Clara noticed this because she was by nature the same kind of person. She recognized it in him the way you sometimes recognize in another person, a habit you have never had a name for in yourself. That quiet, constant attention. That way of watching a room, not for danger exactly, but for information. For the small truths that people reveal without meaning to. He watched the room when she brought his meals. He watched the window and whatever moved beyond it, the slow drift of clouds, the angle of the light, the occasional figure crossing the street below. And he watched her hands when she changed his dressing. Not in any way that made her uncomfortable, but with the focused, careful attention of a man who cataloged details out of long habit, the way a rancher reads weather or a tracker reads ground. On the third morning, without any particular lead-up, he said, "You're not from here." "No," Clara said. She was smoothing the edge of a fresh bandage, keeping her eyes on her work. "Missouri," she added after a moment. "Originally." She glanced up. His pause this time was shorter than the one on the first night, but still deliberate, still considered. "West of here," he said. It was, she would think later, almost certainly true. It was also one of the most carefully constructed non-answers she had ever been handed. Truthful enough to satisfy. Vague enough to reveal nothing at all. On the 4th afternoon, she brought his supper and found him sitting up for the first time. His back was against the headboard, and he was watching the last of the daylight move slow and amber across the rooftops through the window. He looked better. The color had returned to his face. The tightness around his eyes had eased into something closer to rest than endurance. "You'll be able to move around tomorrow," she said, setting the tray on the side table. "Thank you," he said. And then, after a beat of silence that felt intentional rather than empty, for all of it, people said those words often enough that they had worn smooth with use. But Emmett Calloway said them the way a person says something they have been holding for several days, turning it over quietly, making certain they meant it before letting it go. Clara nodded. She moved toward the door. "Miss Whitfield?" She stopped. She had introduced herself only as Clara on the first night. She turned slowly. "Ruth mentioned it," he said, reading her expression before she could arrange it. "I wasn't prying. I just wanted you to know that." Clara looked at him for a moment. This quiet, careful man who had offered almost nothing about himself and yet had gone out of his way to explain that he had not been gathering information about her. "I didn't think you were," she said, and she meant it. She left him to his supper, but in the hallway she paused again. Her fingers rested lightly against the wall. A man that deliberate about how he was perceived was either concealing something or he had been misjudged enough times that honesty had become a kind of armor, worn not out of virtue, but out of the long necessity of self-preservation. She did not know which was true. She was not entirely certain it mattered yet. But standing there in that quiet hallway with the day going dark around her, she realized she wanted to find out. That night, the fever came. Clara woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of breathing that was wrong. Not loud, not ragged, but fast in a way that meant the body had stopped managing things and started surviving them. She was out of bed and down the hall before she had fully decided to move. Room 3 was dark except for the low lamp she had left burning on the side table. Emmett was on his back exactly where she had left him, but his skin had changed. A thin sheen of sweat covered his face and neck, and when she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat of it went through her like a warning. The wound. She pulled the dressing back and knew immediately. The skin around the entry was swollen and red-hot to the touch, and there was a smell beneath the cloth that she recognized from her mother's teaching. Infection. Not yet advanced but moving fast. The kind that announced itself through heat and scent long before it showed in color. Ruth appeared in the doorway already carrying a water. She did not ask what was happening. She simply looked understood and began to move. Hot water, clean cloth. The small bottle of carbolic acid that Ruth kept locked in the kitchen cabinet for exactly this kind of night. Clara worked. She cleaned the wound again deeper, this time more thoroughly than the first night, and she knew it cost him because his breathing changed. It went from fast to controlled, the deliberate rhythm of a man forcing his body to stay still when every instinct it had was telling it to fight. She changed the dressing. She pressed cool cloths against his forehead and neck. She forced water between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow and held his head steady when he was not. He spoke in the worst of it. Salmario. Not much. He was not the kind of man who talked freely, even when control was no longer his to keep. But there were words, fragments that came up from wherever fever pulls things from. The ranch, barely a whisper, and once clear enough that both Clara and Ruth heard it, the name Nolan. And then at the deepest point of the night, when the lamp was guttering and the wind outside pressed against the walls like something trying to get in one word, said with a pain that had nothing to do with the wound. Pa! Clara heard it. She did not react to it. She filed it where she filed everything in that quiet, careful place inside her where she kept the things she was not yet ready to examine. And she kept working. At 4 in the morning, the fever reached its peak. Clara was changing the dressing for the third time, her hand steadied despite the exhaustion that had settled into her shoulders and the backs of her eyes when it happened. His hand moved, not to grip the bedpost, not to clench the blanket. His hand found hers, and he held it, tight. Without consciousness, without intention, without any of the careful deliberation that defined everything else about this man. In the grip of fever, stripped of every defense he had built, his body reached for the one thing that was keeping him here. Clara did not pull away. She sat beside him with one hand held and the other resting on his forehead, and she stayed exactly where she was until the heat began to break. It happened slowly the way dawn happens. Not a single moment of change, but a gradual easing, a long exhale that the whole room seemed to share. By the time the first gray light came through the window, his skin had cooled. His breathing had steadied. His hand had loosened its grip on hers, though it remained close, as though even in sleep some part of him remembered what it had reached for and was not yet ready to let it go entirely. Clara sat in the chair beside his bed and watched the light come in. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. The kind of tiredness that comes from caring intensely about the outcome of something you have no control over. Ruth brought her coffee without being asked and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Clara, then at Emmett, then back at Clara. She said nothing, but there was something in her expression that Clara recognized as understanding. The particular understanding of a woman who had once sat beside a bed like this, in a room like this, and had not been able to keep the person in it. Ruth left, and Clara sat alone with the morning light and the slow breathing of a man she had known for 4 days and had just spent a night fighting to keep alive. When Emmett woke, the sun was fully up. His eyes opened slowly, focused on the ceiling first, then turned to find her. She was still in the chair. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there the evening before. He looked at her. Then he looked down at his hand resting on the blanket near where hers had been. And she saw in his face the quiet recognition of a man who understood what had happened during the night without needing to be told. He did not speak right away. When he did, his voice was rough from the fever, but steady. "You stayed," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said. And that was all. No grand declarations, no promises. Just two people in a small room in a town neither of them had planned to be in, looking at each other in the early morning light, with the kind of honesty that only comes after a night where something real was at stake. Clara stood. Her legs were stiff and her back ached from the chair, and she wanted coffee and sleep in roughly equal measure. She moved toward the door. "Miss Whitfield?" She turned. "Thank you," he said again. But this time the words carried a different weight. This time they were not smooth with use. They were new, specific, earned by what had happened in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. She nodded once and left. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Her hands were trembling now, the delayed reaction that her body had been too disciplined to allow while there was still work to do. She pressed them flat against the cool plaster and breathed. She had come to this town with 12 cents and a lying letter. She had no plan, no family, no place that claimed her. And yet last night she had held a man's life steady with her hands and her patience and a calm she had not known she possessed. And now, standing in the hallway of Ruth Brannigan's boarding house, while the morning light crept across the floorboards and the smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen below, Clara Whitfield felt something she had not felt since stepping off that train 6 weeks ago. She felt present. She felt needed. She felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not yet know his story. She did not know what waited for him 40 miles west, or what his brother had said at a graveside that drove a man like Emmett Calloway off his own land. She did not know why someone had put a bullet in his side, or why the old man in room 2 had looked at him with the quiet recognition of someone matching a face to a memory. She knew only this. She wanted to find out, and that wanting quiet and unhurried and entirely unexpected was enough to make her stay. Emmett Calloway was on his feet by Thursday morning. Clara heard him before she saw him. The slow, careful creak of floorboards in the hallway just after sunrise. The kind of movement that belonged to a man testing his own limits before anyone else was awake to witness the testing. Each step measured, each pause deliberate, as though the hallway were a negotiation between what his body could do and what his pride intended it to do. And he was determined that pride would win. She was already in the kitchen when he appeared in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, dressed in bootshod, his shirt tucked, and his hair pushed back with water, as though he intended the morning to believe he was perfectly fine. He was not perfectly fine. She could see that plainly, the way his weight favored his right side, the slight tension at the corner of his jaw where pain lived when a man was too stubborn to let it show anywhere else. But she did not say so. "Coffee's on," she said, and turned back to the stove. He sat at the far end of the kitchen table without being invited. It told her something about him, not arrogance, long practice. The ease of a man who had made himself at home in unfamiliar places enough times that the act had become second nature. He wrapped both hands around the cup she set in front of him and looked out the window at the pale early light coming over the rooftops. They sat in silence for several minutes. It was not uncomfortable. That surprised her more than anything he had said or done in the 4 days she had known him. Silence between strangers usually carried an obligation, an expectation that someone should fill it. This silence carried nothing except itself, and both of them seemed content to let it stay. "You don't have to remain here on my account," Clara said, eventually refilling her own cup. "Ruth won't charge you past today if you're well enough to ride." Emmett looked at her. "Is that your way of saying I should go?" "It's my way of saying you have the option." He considered that, the way he considered everything, carefully and without hurry. "And if I'm not in a particular hurry to be anywhere," Clara set the coffee pot down, "then Ruth charges by the week, meals included." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile lived when it was not being used. "Fair enough," he said. He stayed. He did not explain why, and Clara did not ask. Over the days that followed, Emmett Calloway became a quiet and undemanding presence in the boarding house. The kind of guest who made his own bed without being reminded, who carried wood in from the pile without being asked, who fixed the rattling window in room 4 with a strip of leather and a patience that suggested he had fixed a great many things in his life and considered none of them worth mentioning. Ruth approved of him immediately and without reservation, which was not something she extended to most people who passed through her door. "Decent man," she told Clara one afternoon, delivering the verdict with the finality of a judge who has heard all the evidence and reached a conclusion that will not be revisited. "Carrying something heavy, but decent." Clara did not disagree. She had arrived at the same conclusion through different observation. What she noticed most was the way Emmett existed in stillness. Most men who passed through Sagebrush Crossing carried their restlessness visibly. They drummed fingers on tabletops, pushed back chairs too hard, looked toward doors as though measuring the distance to the next departure. Emmett was still, not the stillness of someone with nowhere to go, the stillness of someone who had decided after a long time spent moving that he was done running, at least for now. He had a way of being present in a room that changed the room without changing anything visible in it. When he sat at the kitchen table in the mornings, the kitchen felt different, not smaller, not larger, just occupied in a way that it had not been before, as though the space had been waiting for someone to sit in exactly that chair at exactly that angle and look out that window with exactly that expression of quiet attention. And now that it had happened, the room could settle into the version of itself it had always been meant to be. Clara noticed this and was irritated by the noticing. She had spent 6 weeks building a life that did not depend on anyone else's presence. And now here was a man whose presence had somehow rearranged the furniture of her days without moving a single piece. She did not mention this irritation to anyone, least of all to Emmett, and she suspected that Ruth saw it anyway and filed it under the heading of things that did not require comment. She watched him one afternoon from the kitchen window. He was in the small yard behind the boarding house splitting wood. Not with the hurried energy of a man working for someone else, with the steady rhythmic patience of a man who understood what wood needed and was willing to give it the time. The axe rose and fell in an even cadence, and between each stroke he paused just long enough to set the next piece to read the grain, to find the line where the wood wanted to come apart. It was the way a man worked when work was not a task but a language. When his hands knew things his mouth would never say. That evening, Clara helped him bring in the last of the split wood. Their arms were full, and the air was sharp with the smell of cut pine and approaching cold, and as they stacked the wood against the kitchen wall, their hands brushed once. Neither of them acknowledged it, but neither of them moved away either. The following morning, Ruth asked Clara to carry Emmett's saddlebags down from the storage room. He was not yet strong enough to manage the stairs with weight, and Ruth wanted the room cleared for potential guests. Clara carried the bags to the small shed beside the back porch, and as she set them down, the leather flap on one side fell open. Inside, beneath a folded shirt and a coil of rope, was a leather pouch. It was heavier than it should have been. She did not open it deliberately. It simply moved when the bag tilted and the mouth of the pouch loosened, and she saw what was inside. Gold coins, not a fortune, but considerably more than any drifting ranch hand ought to be carrying in his saddlebags along a mountain road in Wyoming. Enough to buy a piece of land outright, enough to start again somewhere as someone with means. Clara looked at the coins for a long moment. Then she closed the pouch, set it back exactly where it had been, and retied the leather flap. She did not mention it to Ruth. She did not mention it to Emmett. She simply added it to the growing collection of things she had noticed about this man, things that did not yet form a complete picture, but were beginning to suggest that the picture, when it finally came together, would be considerably larger than the frame she had been trying to fit it into. That same afternoon, she caught Mr. Pemberton looking at Emmett. It happened in the front room while Emmett was crossing from the hallway to the kitchen. Pemberton was in his usual chair, book open on his lap, but his eyes were not on the page. They were on Emmett. And the way Pemberton looked at him was different from the way he looked at everyone else. It was the look of a man comparing the face before him to one stored carefully in memory, the way a person holds a photograph beside a living face and searches for the match. The moment passed quickly. Pemberton returned to his book. But that evening, when Clara walked past his room on her way to bed, she noticed the small notebook open on his table and the sound of his pen moving quickly across the page. He was writing more than usual. She did not ask why. It was on a quiet Saturday afternoon that the first thread began to loosen. Clara was mending a curtain from room 2, sitting by the front window where the light was best, when a man she did not recognize came through the front door without knocking. He was broad-shouldered and trail-dusty, 50 years old or near it, and he wore the particular expression of someone who had ridden a long way with a specific purpose and was not interested in small talk before getting to it. His eyes moved across the room, slowly, cataloging, and then they stopped on Emmett, who was sitting near the opposite window reading a newspaper he had folded to a precise quarter size. Something shifted in the stranger's face. Recognition, relief, and something else beneath both that looked to Clara's practiced eye like reluctance. Calloway, he said. Emmett lowered the newspaper with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had heard his name said in that particular tone before and had decided some time ago not to let it rearrange him. Sawyer, he said. Clara kept her eyes on the curtain in her lap, but her hands had gone still. The man called Sawyer crossed the room and sat across from Emmett without being offered a seat. He was quiet for a moment, working the brim of his hat between thick, weathered fingers. Your brother's been asking, he said, low. The kind of low that is meant for one person but understands that walls are thin and rooms are small. About the deed, about what you intend to do. My intentions haven't changed, Emmett said. He says they have to, says the bank won't wait past the first of the year. Sawyer paused. His eyes moved once in Clara's direction, then back to Emmett. He needs your signature. Emmett, whether you're done with that place or not, your name is still on half of it. A silence followed that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the walls of a room and made the space feel smaller than it was. And Cross is pushing, Sawyer added even lower. He's met with Nolan twice now, second time he brought a lawyer. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Clara felt the ripple of it without looking up. Cross, the name Della had connected to Lyle Muir, the name Ruth spoke of with the careful restraint of a woman who had learned to live near something dangerous by never turning her back on it. Tell my brother I'll consider it, Emmett said finally. Sawyer looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, stood, and left without another word. The front door closed behind him, and the room settled back into its ordinary quiet. Emmett refolded the newspaper. He did not look in Clara's direction. She returned to the curtain and said nothing. But the word deed sat in the back of her mind for the rest of the afternoon. And alongside it, the other word, brother, a man who answered no when asked if he had family, a man whose hands lay open at his sides while strangers dressed his wounds, a man who was hiding not just from pain, but from the people in the place that had caused it, and who carried gold in his saddlebags like a man who had once owned something worth more than gold and had walked away from it. That evening after supper, Emmett found her on the back porch. She was sitting on the top step with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, watching the last light leave the sky in long horizontal strips of orange and gray. The mountains to the west were dark shapes against the fading glow, and the first stars were beginning to show faint and uncertain, as though they were not yet committed to appearing. He came out quietly and stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, looking at the same skyline. For a while, neither of them said anything. The wind moved through the sagebrush at the edge of town and carried with it the dry, sweet scent of a land preparing itself for winter. I owe you an explanation, he said at last. You don't, Clara said. Not to me. Maybe not. He was quiet for a moment. But I'd like to offer one anyway. She waited. The tea in her hands had gone completely cold now, but she did not set it down. Holding it gave her something to do with her hands, and she had learned a long time ago that people spoke more freely when the person listening appeared occupied with something else. I grew up on a ranch, he said. West of here, large spread, been in my family a long time. He said it plainly without pride or apology. The way a man states a fact he has carried so long, it has lost its ability to impress him. My grandfather started with 60 acres and 1 horse. My father turned it into one of the largest operations in this part of the territory. He paused, not for effect, for accuracy. My father passed 2 years ago, left the ranch to my brother and me, equal share. Another pause, longer this time. My brother and I don't agree on much. Haven't for a long time. Nolan is 3 years older. Practical, hard. The kind of man who sees the numbers first and the meaning second. After our father's funeral, he wanted to sell the South Range to the bank, to Cross. Emmett's voice did not change when he said the name, but something in the air around it did, the way air changes before a storm, not in temperature, but in pressure. I refused. That land is where our father and our grandfather worked with their hands. Selling it felt like selling something that wasn't ours to sell. It got personal, Clara said quietly. It got personal, he confirmed. Things were said at the graveside that couldn't be unsaid. Nolan told me I loved the land more than I loved my family. I told him he was selling our father's soul to keep up appearances. He looked at the darkening sky. Both of those things were unfair, and both had just enough truth in them to do real damage. So you walked away. I thought distance would settle it. That time would do what conversation couldn't. Did it? He looked at her then, directly, with an honesty that had no decoration on it. No, he said. It just moved the problem further down the road. Clara turned her cup slowly between her palms. And now the road is caught up. Seems that way. Somewhere down the street a door closed. A dog barked twice and went quiet, as though it too had decided the evening was not worth arguing with. Can I ask you something? Clara said. Yes. Do you want to go back? The question landed between them and stayed there. Emmett did not answer immediately, his jaw set in that particular way of someone sorting through something complicated, something with roots that went deeper than the surface question suggested. Part of me does, he said finally. The part that remembers what the south pasture looks like after rain, the sound the creek makes in early late spring. There's a ridge on the eastern boundary where you can see 4 counties on a clear day. He stopped. Something in his voice shifted, softened, became the voice of a man describing something he loved but had been afraid to admit loving. The rest of me isn't sure that part can be trusted. Clara considered that. She looked at the stars which had committed to appearing now and were scattered across the sky with the quiet confidence of things that had been there all along and would continue to be there long after this conversation was forgotten. That sounds like a man who still cares about something he's been pretending not to care about, she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite surprise, something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been accurately described by someone who had no obvious reason to see them that clearly. You're perceptive, he said. I've had time to practice, she replied. Being overlooked gives you that. It came out before she had decided to say it. She did not look at him when it landed, but Emmett turned toward her slowly, and when she finally glanced up, he was not wearing the polite expression she expected. He was looking at her the way he looked at everything, with that steady, unhurried attention, as though what she had just said mattered enough to be received properly. Whoever left you standing on that platform, he said, and his voice was careful and low, was a fool. Clara felt something shift in her chest, small and quiet, like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. She looked back at the stars rather than at him. Maybe, she said softly, or maybe it worked out the way it was supposed to. Over the following week, their rhythm deepened in ways that neither of them commented on. Coffee in the mornings before anyone else was awake. Quiet conversations in the kitchen while Clara cooked and Emmett found reasons to be nearby. The borrowed ease of 2 people who had each spent a long time alone and now found unexpectedly that the other's presence did not cost them anything. If anything, it gave. He told her about the ranch. Not the size of it, not the worth of it, but the particular things. The way the south pasture looked after rain, the grass bent heavy and silver in the wind, the sound the creek made in early spring when the snowmelt came down from the mountains and turned the water fast and cold and bright. A ridge on the eastern boundary where his father used to stand with one hand shading his eyes, looking out over the land that 3 generations of Callaway hands had shaped from nothing. She told him about Missouri, about her mother who could identify infection by smell and set a broken bone by touch, and who died in February with frost still on the window and her hands still warm in Clara's. About her father who followed 2 years later because he had simply run out of reasons to stay. About the letter from Lyle Muir, the platform, the 12 cents. She told it plainly, without self-pity, the way she had come to understand her own story. Not as a tragedy, but as a series of events that had led her by an unlikely and indirect route to exactly where she was sitting. You deserved better than that, Emmett said when she finished. I got better than that, she said, and she meant it simply, as a statement of fact about the present rather than a consolation for the past. Then Della brought the warning. She came into the boarding house one afternoon with her usual quick step, but her face was wrong. The brightness that normally lived there had been replaced by something tighter, something that looked on a woman who rarely wore worry like real concern. There's talk, Della said, leaning close to Clara at the kitchen table while Ruth was upstairs changing linens. Someone saw Lyle Muir in Ridgewater, half a day's ride east. He was asking about you, asking about the girl from Missouri. She paused. Her voice dropped. Honey, be careful. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. The recognition that a thing she had believed was finished had simply been waiting. A week later, Lyle Muir walked through the front door of Ruth Brannigan's boarding house at noon on a Wednesday. He was thinner than Clara had imagined from his letters. 33 years old, but wearing them poorly the way a man wears years, when most of them have been spent running from something. His clothes had once been good, but were now wrinkled and road-stained, and his eyes moved fast when he entered, scanning the room before settling on any one person. The habit of a man who checked exits before he checked faces. He saw Clara, and he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had practiced looking pleased and had never quite mastered it. "Clara," he said, as though no time had passed, as though he had not disappeared 3 weeks before she arrived with nothing but silence left behind. Ruth was in the front room. Della was there too, having come over with a delivery of flour. Mr. Pemberton sat in his usual chair with his book open on his lap, his eyes sharp above the pages. "I've come back for you," Muir said, loud enough for the room, confident enough for no one. "Had to settle some business. Took longer than expected. But I'm here now." He spread his hands as though offering something generous. "Ready to make good on my word." Clara looked at him. She looked at this man who had written her 11 letters full of promises and then vanished before she arrived to collect on a single one of them. She looked at his nervous eyes and his wrinkled coat and his smile that did not reach anywhere important. And then she put down the cloth she had been holding. She set it on the table with the slow, deliberate care of someone who is about to say something they want heard clearly. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet she had learned to share with Emmett over morning coffee. The charged quiet of a space where something is about to happen. "You left," Clara said. Her voice was even, controlled. 3 weeks before I arrived. No letter, no word, no forwarding address. You sent me a train ticket to a town you had already abandoned." Muir's smile faltered. "Now, Clara, I can explain. I am not finished." The words came out with a precision that surprised even her. She had not planned this. She had not rehearsed it in the dark hours of sleepless nights or imagined it during quiet afternoons. But now that the moment was here, the words were ready. They had been ready for 6 weeks. They had been ready since the platform. "I came here with 12 cents, she said. "I had no one to turn to, no family, no plan. And I survived. I found work. I made a place for myself in this town. I did that. Not you, not your promises, not your letters." She paused, let the silence carry its own weight. "I am not luggage you left behind and can collect whenever it suits you. I don't belong to you. I never did." The room held its breath. Muir's expression changed. The false confidence cracked, and beneath it Clara saw something else, something harder, something that had been sent here rather than chosen to come. "Judge Cross has taken an interest in your well-being," Muir said. His voice had dropped, and the words came out with the particular quality of a line that has been given to a man rather than thought of by him. "You should be grateful someone's thinking about your future." The name landed in the room like a match on dry wood. Clara felt it. Ruth felt it. Della's face went pale. And then Emmett was there. He appeared in the kitchen doorway the way weather appears on a horizon. Not sudden, not dramatic, simply present in a way that rearranged everything around it. He did not speak. He did not step between Clara and Muir. He did not make any gesture that could be called protective or possessive or threatening. He simply walked into the room and stood a few paces behind Clara. Close enough that Muir could see him. Far enough that Clara knew this was her ground, and he was not claiming it. He was not rescuing her. He was letting her know she was not alone. And there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than most people understood. Muir looked at Emmett. He measured what he saw. A tall man with dark hair and steady eyes, and the kind of quiet that does not come from having nothing to say, but from having decided that what he might say would make the room a different kind of place. Muir made his calculation quickly. "I'll be back," he said, and left. The door closed. The room exhaled. Pemberton looked up from his book. His voice was soft, but carried clearly in the silence that followed. "That young woman should be cautious," he said to Ruth, though his eyes remained on the door through which Muir had departed. "Cross doesn't send men just to talk." That night alone in the kitchen after the others had gone to bed, Emmett told her about the bullet. "You deserve to know more," he said, "about me, about why I'm here." He told her about the 2 years of wandering, working other men's ranches under names that were not his own, keeping his head down, trying to disappear from the life he had walked away from, and then hearing through the slow grapevine of frontier talk that Cross was pressuring Nolan to sell. I went back, not all the way, just close enough to see what was happening. He paused. Two men found me on a mountain road. They didn't rob me. They shot me and told me to keep moving. Clara sat across from him. The lamp between them threw long shadows up the walls. They were Cross's men, she said. Not a question. I can't prove it, but I know it the way I know weather, by what the air feels like before the thing arrives. She was quiet for a moment. And you came here. I came here because I was bleeding, and this was the nearest town with a roof. I stayed because he stopped, chose his words the way he chose each stroke when he split wood. Carefully, along the line where the thing wanted to come apart. I stayed because for the first time in 2 years I didn't feel like I needed to keep running. The following morning brought a letter addressed to Emmett Calloway, care of Ruth Brannigan's boarding house, which meant someone knew exactly where to find him. He read it at the kitchen table while Clara made breakfast. His face gave nothing away. But when he folded it and set it down, his hand rested on top of it for just a moment too long. I need to ride out, he said. Few days, maybe more. Clara kept her attention on the pan in front of her. All right, I'll be back, he said. And then as though he understood, that was an easy thing to say and a harder thing to mean, he added, I want to be back. She turned to look at him. He was already watching her. That quiet directness she had come to recognize as simply the way he was. Not performance, not strategy, just honesty arriving without ceremony. Then come back, she said simply. He nodded once, took his hat from the hook by the door, and just before he stepped outside into the cold morning air, he paused with his hand on the door frame. The same frame she had stood in the first night, watching him lie still and silent, while she dressed a wound she had not caused. He did not say anything else, but the pause itself said something that neither of them was quite ready to put into words yet. The door closed behind him. The kitchen was quiet. Clara stood at the stove for a long moment, her hand resting on the handle of the pan, looking at the place where he had been. She was going to miss him. Already before he had cleared the edge of town, she was going to miss him in a way that had no sensible explanation given how little time had passed and how little had actually been said between them. But sense had very little to do with it, and she had spent enough of her life being sensible to know that some things arrived on their own schedule and did not care whether you were ready for them. He was gone for 11 days. Clara did not count on them deliberately. She simply noticed the way you notice weather, that the days had a different quality to them while Emmett was away. Not worse exactly, just quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. The mornings were the hardest. She would come into the kitchen before dawn, light the stove, and put the coffee on, and for a moment before she was fully awake, she would set 2 cups on the table instead of 1. The first time it happened, she stared at the second cup for a long moment, then put it back in the cupboard without ceremony. The second time she left it there. She did not examine why. She simply drank her coffee and looked at the empty chair and the empty cup in the window that showed the same road leading west that it always showed, and she waited for the feeling to pass. It passed, but it came back the next morning and the morning after that, and she stopped trying to put the cup away. Ruth noticed too. Though she said nothing directly, she had a talent for observing things and filing them away without comment, which Clara had come to appreciate as one of the most generous forms of friendship a person could offer. But Ruth showed her awareness in other ways. She made sure the coffee was always ready before Clara came downstairs. She found small tasks to keep Clara busy during the long afternoon hours, when the boarding house went quiet and the wind came hard off the mountains and there was nothing to do but think. She asked Clara to teach her the bread variation that Clara's mother had made, the one with rosemary and salt, and they spent an entire afternoon in the kitchen together, hands in dough, talking about nothing important, which was exactly what Clara needed. On the third day, Della came by with a bolt of fabric she claimed she couldn't sell. Wrong color for anyone in this town, she said, setting it on the kitchen table. But it would make a fine dress for someone with dark hair and a good eye for stitching. Clara knew it was a gift dressed as charity, and she appreciated the dressing as much as the gift. She cut the fabric that evening and began to sew, and the work of it, the careful measuring and cutting and joining, gave her hands something to do that was not waiting. On the 6th day, a brief note arrived. 2 words in a hand she recognized. Still here. She read it twice, set it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light could reach it, and went back to work. It was during those 11 days, while the boarding house settled into its slightly emptier routine, that Mr. Pemberton invited Claire to sit with him. He poured tea from a pot he kept in his room using cups that did not match, in a manner that suggested a lifetime of pouring tea for people in rooms more formal than this one. He spoke about the weather first, then about the book he was reading. Then, with the careful precision of a man who had spent a career choosing his words for their legal weight, he set his cup down and looked at her directly. "I know the Calloway family," he said. Clara's hand stopped halfway to her cup. "I was a lawyer," Pemberton continued, "in Cheyenne. 5 years ago, I was asked to travel to the Calloway Ranch to draft a will for Silas Calloway, Emmett's father." He folded his hands on the table. "The Calloway Ranch is one of the largest spreads in western Wyoming, several thousand acres. Cattle water rights timber, worth more than most men see in a lifetime." Clara said nothing. She waited the way Emmett waited, with patience and without hurry. Silas knew his health was failing. He wanted everything settled before it was too late. "I drafted the will. I witnessed him sign it. He was sharp as a man half his age, knew exactly what he wanted and why." Pemberton paused. He also included a provision. If either son sold his share to anyone outside the family within 5 years of Silas's death, the other son would have the right to buy it back at an assessed price. He designed it specifically to protect the land from speculators. "From Cross," Clara said. Pemberton looked at her with the faint surprise of a man who had expected to explain more than he needed to. "From Cross," he confirmed. Silas knew what Cross was. He'd watched him buy land from desperate families for years. He wasn't going to let that happen to his ranch. He picked up his teacup, then set it down again without drinking. "I came to Sagebrush Crossing 6 months ago. I heard through former colleagues that Cross was making moves against the Calloway estate, challenging the will, pressuring the older son. And you felt responsible," Clara said. "I wrote that document," Pemberton said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who understood that some obligations outlive the transactions that created them. "I watched Silas sign it with a steady hand and a clear mind. I will not sit in Cheyenne reading books while someone with a bought lawyer tries to say otherwise." Clara sat with that for a long moment. The pieces she had been collecting, the gold in the saddlebags, the word deed spoken in a hushed voice by a dusty man named Sawyer, the name Cross connecting Lyle Muir to Emmett Calloway, to a piece of land she had never seen. All of them rearranged themselves into a picture that was larger and more complicated and considerably more dangerous than she had imagined. Emmett was not a drifting cowboy. He was the co-heir to an empire of land and water, and he was out there somewhere 40 miles west, facing alone the same people who had already put a bullet in his side. She stood. She thanked Pemberton for the tea. She walked downstairs to the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the road that led west, the same road Emmett had ridden down 11 days ago. And then she heard hoofbeats. Not one horse, two. She did not go to the door. She stayed at the stove and listened. Boots on the porch steps. The familiar weight of a knock she somehow already recognized, though she had only heard it a handful of times. Ruth answered, and Clara heard the low exchange of voices in the front room. Ruth's practical warmth, Emmett's unhurried tone. Then a second voice, a man's voice, similar to Emmett's but sharper, harder, carrying the particular weight of someone who had been in charge of something difficult for a long time and was running out of patience with the difficulty. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and looked into the front room. Emmett was there, trail-worn, tired in the way of a man who had carried something heavy over a long distance, not just in miles. And beside him stood a man she had never seen but recognized immediately, taller by an inch, broader in the shoulders, the same dark hair but coarser, beaten stiff by wind and sun. A face that did not look like a villain's face. It looked like the face of a man who was exhausted from being the one who stayed. Nolan Calloway had come to Sagebrush Crossing. Nolan Calloway did not look like a man who had come to fight. He looked like a man who had come to the end of something. The kind of end that arrives not with a single blow but with the slow accumulation of weight, day after day, decision after decision, until the body carries so much that even standing still becomes an act of endurance. He stood in Ruth Brannigan's front room, with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving across the space with the careful attention of someone who had spent a long time being responsible for things and could not turn off the habit of assessing even when the things before him were not his to manage. He was 40 years old. He looked 45. Not because time had been unkind, but because time had been relentless, and there was a difference. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked cattle and mended fences and dug post holes in frozen ground since he was old enough to hold a tool. They were cracked at the knuckles and dark at the creases, and they held his hat brim, the way a man holds something when he needs his hands to be busy so the rest of him can hold still. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. She watched Emmett, standing 3 feet from his brother, close enough to speak, but far enough to maintain the distance that 2 years of silence had built between them. She watched the way they did not look at each other directly, the way two men avoid looking at something that hurts. And she watched the moment when Nolan's eyes found her. "Who's this?" he said. Not unkindly, but with the bluntness of a man who did not have time for information he had not asked for. Emmett did not hesitate. "Someone important to me," he said. It was the first time he had said it aloud. Clara heard every word of it, and each one landed in a place she had not known was waiting to receive it. Nolan looked at her a moment longer, then back at his brother. Whatever he saw in Emmett's face when he said those words seemed to settle something in him, or at least to push it aside for the moment, because he nodded once and said, "We need to talk." Ruth put Nolan in room 5. She fed both brothers supper at the kitchen table while Clara served, and Pemberton sat in his usual chair in the front room reading nothing, hearing everything. The meal was quiet. Nolan ate the way a man eats when he has been riding hard and knows that the conversation waiting on the other side of the plate will be harder than the ride. Emmett ate less and watched his brother with the particular attention of someone trying to read a language he used to speak fluently but had not practiced in a long time. After Ruth cleared the dishes and excused herself, the two brothers sat across from each other in the lamplight. Clara moved to leave, but Emmett looked at her and the look said, "Stay." So she stayed. She sat at the end of the table and folded her hands and did what she had always done best. She watched. She listened. She paid attention. "I didn't come here to argue about the past," Nolan said. He reached into his coat and set a folded sheaf of papers on the table between them. The papers were creased from travel and slightly damp at the edges, and they sat on the kitchen table with the particular heaviness of documents that carry consequences. "Cross-filed suit," Nolan said. "3 weeks ago, he's challenging the will." Emmett's face changed. Not dramatically. The way a landscape changes when a cloud passes over the sun. The same features, the same lines, but the light falling differently on all of it. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming Pa wasn't of sound mind when he signed it. Says he has witnesses. People willing to testify that the old man was confused, forgetful, making decisions that didn't hold together." Nolan's voice was flat with the effort of keeping it flat. "You and I both know that's a lie. Pa was sharper at 70 than most men are at 40. But Cross has a lawyer from Cheyenne, and the lawyer has paperwork. And paperwork has a way of making lies look orderly. If he invalidates the will, the protection clause goes with it. Both our shares become unprotected assets, and Cross can buy directly. From me, from you, from the bank that holds the note." Nolan leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him. "He wants the whole thing, Emmett. Not a piece, the whole ranch. The water rights, the timber. Everything Pa and Grandpa built." The room was very still. Outside, the wind pressed against the boarding house walls with the steady, indifferent pressure of a force that would outlast everything inside. "You said he has witnesses who testify Pa wasn't sound," Emmett said slowly. "Who?" "Henry Alcott. You remember him. Ran the feed store in Coulter. Cross bought his property last year after Alcott's wife died and the bills came due. Man owes Cross everything he has left." Nolan paused. "And Jessup Brand, same story, different details, same result. Cross doesn't just buy land, he buys people. And he uses them when he needs them." Clara thought of Lyle Muir, of his nervous eyes and his wrinkled coat, and the words that had come out of his mouth with a particular quality of lines that had been handed to him rather than thought of by him. "Cross doesn't send men just to talk," Pemberton had said, and now she understood the full shape of it. Cross did not just send men, he collected them. Gathered up people who owed him, who feared him, who had been broken just enough to become useful, and he deployed them the way a chess player deploys pieces, without sentiment, without waste. "So what do you need from me?" Emmett asked. And there it was, the question that mattered. Not what do you want, or what Not what happened between us. What do you need from me? The question of a man who was finished with the luxury of resentment and had arrived at the harder, heavier place of obligation. Nolan looked at his brother, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, something in his expression softened. Not completely. Not the way a man softens when he forgives. The way a man softens when he realizes that the person across from him is offering something he had not expected to receive. I need you to stand with me, Nolan said. At the hearing, before the territorial commissioner, I need Cross to see both of us, together. I need him to know that whatever is broken between us is not broken enough for him to walk through. The silence that followed was long enough for the lamp to flicker twice and the wind to shift direction outside. Clara watched Emmett's face. She watched the war in it. The old anger still there, still sharp, pulling against something newer and heavier and more important than anger had ever been. What about what you said at the funeral? Emmett asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried an edge that had been waiting 2 years to be heard. You told me I loved the land more than my family. I know what I said. Did you mean it? Nolan was quiet for a long time. He looked at the table, at the papers, at his own hands. I meant it when I said it, he answered finally. I don't know if I mean it now. I know I was angry. I know I was scared. I just buried my father, and I was looking at a ranch I didn't know how to run alone. And you were standing there talking about the land like it was sacred, while I was trying to figure out how to keep the lights on. He paused. That doesn't make what I said right, but it's where it came from. Emmett absorbed that, the way a man absorbs a blow he has been expecting. It hurts, but the anticipation has taken the surprise out of it, and without surprise, pain becomes something that can be carried rather than something that knocks you down. I said you were selling Pa's soul, Emmett said. That wasn't fair either. No, Nolan agreed. It wasn't. They looked at each other across the table. Two brothers. Same blood, same land, same father buried in the same ground. And between them, 2 years of silence that had grown so large, it had become its own presence in the room. A third brother made of all the things they had not said. Emmett spoke. His voice was low. So what do we do next? We. The words sat in the air between them. Small, ordinary, and carrying more weight than either of them could have explained to anyone who had not been in that room at that moment. We fight, Nolan said, together. Later that night, after Nolan had gone to his room and the boarding house had settled into its familiar sounds of wind and wood and quiet, Emmett and Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. There's something else I need to tell you, he said. Clara folded her hands on the table. The lamp burned low between them. The South Range I kept, he said. It's not a small piece of land. The ranch my family built, what I walked away from, it's one of the largest spreads in this part of the territory. He said it without ceremony, the same way he said everything, as though the size of the thing was the least important fact about it. I wasn't hiding it to deceive you. I was hiding it from everyone, because I didn't want it to be the first thing people saw when they looked at me. A pause, Sean. It usually is. Clara was quiet for a moment. The wind outside shifted, and the kitchen lamp flickered once and steadied. Is that why you never said? She asked. Partly. He looked at her directly. And partly because it didn't feel like the most important thing about me. Not here. Not with you. The words settled between them. Not heavy, but permanent. The kind of thing said once and then simply true from that point forward. It isn't, she said finally, the most important thing. Something in his expression eased. Not dramatically, just the way a man's shoulders come down when he sets something on the ground after carrying it longer than he should have. That night alone in her room, Clara opened her trunk. She was looking for documents. Pemberton had suggested she might be called to testify about Lyle Muir, about his character and his connection to Cross, and she wanted to gather whatever she had. The letters, the train ticket, anything that established the pattern of a man who made promises he never intended to keep on behalf of a man who collected debts in human currency. She found the letters easily. They were bundled together with a piece of string. 11 sheets of paper filled with words that had once meant everything and now meant nothing except evidence. She set them aside, and then at the bottom of the trunk beneath the clothes she had sewn for a life that never happened, she found it. A second envelope. From Lyle Muir. It had arrived with the train ticket, 2 envelopes in the same post. She had opened the one with the ticket and put the other in the trunk, assuming it was a love letter, a companion piece to the ticket, something sweet and unnecessary that she would read later when she had time to enjoy it. She had never opened it. 6 weeks it had been there, resting against the bottom of the trunk like a stone at the bottom of a river, invisible beneath everything that had settled on top of it. Clara picked it up. The paper was clean and unworn, untouched by the months of handling that had softened the other letters. She turned it over, unsealed it, and read. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Judge Harlan Cross. Muir had placed it in the wrong envelope. Or perhaps he had placed it deliberately careless in the particular way of a man who was managing too many deceptions at once and had lost track of which lies went in which direction. The letter confirmed a transaction. Muir wrote that the woman would arrive on the expected date, that she had no family, no connections, no one who would ask questions, that she would be compliant, that in exchange his debt to Cross would be considered settled. Clara read the letter twice. The first time her hands trembled. Not from fear, from the sudden full-weight recognition of what she had been to Lyle Muir. Not a bride, not a promise, a payment, a living, breathing settlement of a debt she had never known existed, offered by a man she had never met, to a man whose name she had first heard, whispered over a general store counter. The second time she read it, her hands were steady, and what she felt was not pain and not sorrow. It was anger. The quiet, deep, load-bearing kind, the kind that does not scream or break things, the kind that builds walls and digs foundations and refuses to be moved. She brought the letter downstairs. Pemberton was still awake, reading by lamplight in the front room. She handed it to him without explanation. He read it slowly, then he looked up at her over the edge of the paper. "This doesn't put him in jail," Pemberton said, "but it puts him on trial in the court of opinion, and before a territorial commissioner, opinion is currency." He folded the letter carefully. "This shows what Cross is, not what he's done to the Callaways, what he does to everyone. The pattern, the method, the machinery of it." He handed the letter back. "Keep this safe, Miss Whitfield. It may be the most important piece of paper in this territory." In the days before the hearing, Cross made his move against the boarding house. A man Clara did not recognize rode up to the front porch on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with Ruth. He was polite in the way that men are polite when they have been instructed to deliver a threat without raising their voice. He informed Ruth that the parcel of land on which the boarding house stood was subject to a lien that Judge Cross held, acquired 2 years prior from the previous owner's unpaid taxes. He suggested that it would be in Mrs. Brannigan's best interest to reconsider who she chose to shelter under her roof. He did not name the Callaways specifically. He did not need to. Ruth stood in the doorway and listened to every word. When the man finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You can tell Harlan Cross that he has been threatening me with that same lien for 8 years. I am still here. He is still threatening, but I sleep better than he does." She paused. "And you can also tell him that the next man he sends to my door had better be bringing something more persuasive than paperwork, because I have been running this house alone since before Judge Cross decided he was important, and I will be running it long after he remembers that he isn't." She closed the door. The man rode away. Ruth went back to the kitchen and continued kneading bread as though nothing had happened. But that evening, Clara noticed something she had not expected. Boone Hadley, a quiet farmer from the edge of town, whose own land Cross had once bought at a fraction of its value, appeared at the boarding house with a sack of potatoes and a question. "Anything I can do?" he asked Ruth. He did not say for what. Ruth did not ask him to clarify. Della closed her shop an hour early the next day and came to the boarding house with flour and coffee and the particular expression of a woman who had decided which side of a line she was standing on. 2 other families stopped by during the week, ranchers from outlying properties, men and women who said little but whose presence said what their words did not. Sagebrush Crossing was a small town, and in small towns, when a bully pushes too hard, the people who have been pushed before tend to remember it. They do not organize. They do not make speeches. They simply show up. And showing up in a place where silence has been the safest option for years is its own kind of courage. The hearing was held on a cold morning in late November at the Sagebrush Crossing Town Hall, a building that served variously as courtroom, meeting place, and Sunday overflow when the church pews were full. The territorial commissioner had arrived the previous evening, a lean man with gray sideburns, and the patient expression of someone whose job required him to sit through a great many arguments in order to find the small, hard truth buried inside each one. Judge Harlan Cross sat on the left side of the room with his Cheyenne lawyer. Cross was 58 years old, silver-haired, well-dressed in a territory where most men owned one good suit and wore it to funerals and nothing else. He did not look like a villain. He looked like authority, like the kind of man who made decisions that other people lived with and who had done so long enough that the habit of power had become indistinguishable from the man himself. Emmett and Nolan Calloway sat on the right. Behind them, Pemberton. Beside Pemberton, Clara. And behind all of them, filling the remaining chairs and lining the walls and standing in the doorway because there were not enough chairs, the people of Sagebrush Crossing. Ruth Brannigan in a clean apron, arms crossed. Della Pruitt with her shop closed for the morning. Boone Hadley standing at the back with his hat in his hands and his jaw set. The ranchers who had stopped by the boarding house during the week. The families who had been quiet for years and had decided on this particular morning to be present. They had not been asked to come. They had simply come. The way people come when something that matters is being decided, and they want whoever is deciding to know that someone is watching. Cross's lawyer spoke first. Practiced, polished, presenting the case with the smooth assurance of a man who was being paid well to make a lie sound reasonable. Silas Calloway had been elderly. His judgment had been compromised. Witnesses could attest to confusion, to poor decisions, to the erratic behavior of a man whose mind was no longer his own. The will, therefore, was not a reflection of sound intent, but of diminished capacity and should be set aside. The witnesses were brought forward. Henry Alcott, a thin man who kept his eyes on the floor and spoke in the halting rhythm of someone reciting words he had been told to memorize. Jessup Brand, who was more convincing, but whose hands shook when Cross looked at him. Then Pemberton stood. He was wearing his old suit, the one Claire had seen hanging in his closet pressed and waiting as though it had known this day would come, even if its owner had not been certain. He stood straight despite his 68 years, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms and understood that the most powerful thing a lawyer could do was tell the truth simply. I drafted Silas Calloway's will, he said. I sat across from him for the better part of a day while we discussed his wishes, his land, his sons, his legacy. Pemberton looked at the commissioner. He was not confused. He was not diminished. He knew exactly what he owned, exactly what it was worth, and exactly what he wanted done with it. He asked me detailed questions about territorial property law. He corrected a clause I had written because he understood its implications better than I did. Pemberton paused. Silas Calloway was on the day he signed that will one of the sharpest men I have ever had the privilege of working with, and I have worked with a great many. He sat down. The room was quiet. Then Clara stood. She had not planned to speak. She had planned to hand the letter to Pemberton and let him present it. But standing there in that room surrounded by people who had come because they cared about something larger than themselves, she understood that this was her piece of the story to tell. Not Pemberton's, not Emmett's, hers. My name is Clara Whitfield, she said. Her voice was steady. I came to Sagebrush Crossing in September because a man named Lyle Muir promised me a home and a life. He sent me a train ticket, and then he disappeared before I arrived. She held up the letter. This is a letter Lyle Muir wrote to Judge Cross. It was placed in my envelope by mistake. In it, Mr. Muir confirms an arrangement. He would bring me to Sagebrush Crossing, a woman with no family, no connections, no one to ask questions. In exchange, his debt to Judge Cross would be settled. She let the words land. She let the room absorb them. She watched Cross's face, and she saw the precise moment when the control he had worn like a second skin for 30 years cracked. Just a fraction, just enough to let something real show through. I am not here to make a legal argument, Clara said. I am here to show you who this man is, not what he's done to the Calloway family. What he does to everyone. He finds people who are desperate and he uses them. He finds debts and he turns them into leverage. He finds weakness and he calls it opportunity. She set the letter on the commissioner's table. That is the man who is asking you to believe that Silas Calloway didn't know his own mind. The commissioner read the letter. The room waited. Cross's lawyer leaned close to Cross and whispered something. Cross did not respond. He was looking at Clara with the expression of a man who had underestimated something and was only now calculating the cost of that underestimation. Lyle Muir was called forward. He had been sitting near the back of the room brought in from Ridgewater the previous day, and he stood now with the particular misery of a man who had run out of places to run. Under oath, with the commissioner's eyes on him and the eyes of every person in Sagebrush Crossing behind him, he did not have the courage to lie. He confirmed the arrangement. He confirmed his debt to Cross. He confirmed in a voice that shook that he had brought Clara to this town not as a bride, but as a payment. Then Emmett stood, and he did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "I'd like my brother to speak," he said. Nolan looked at him. For a moment, the older brother's face held an expression that Clara could not entirely read. Not surprise exactly, something deeper. The recognition that someone you had wounded was handing you a gift you had not earned. Nolan stood. He was not a man built for public speaking. His voice was rough at the edges, and his hands gripped the back of the chair in front of him with the force of someone holding on to the only steady thing in a tilting room. But when he spoke, the room leaned in to listen. He talked about his father. Not about the will, not about the land, about the man, about Silas Calloway, who woke at 4 in the morning every day for 40 years because the cattle didn't care what time a man wanted to sleep. Who knew the name of every animal on his ranch, not by number, but by the way they moved and the sound they made and the particular tilt of their heads when the weather was changing. Who repaired fences in the rain because a fence that was broken on Monday would still be broken on Tuesday, and a man who put off what needed doing was a man who did not deserve what he had. Who had built everything from 60 acres and one horse in the kind of stubbornness that most people called foolish until it worked. Nolan's voice broke once, near the end, when he said the word father for the last time. He did not try to hide it. He simply stopped talking for a moment, let the silence hold the weight of what he was feeling, and then finished. "That man knew his own mind," Nolan said. "Better than anyone in this room. Better than anyone in this territory. And if you set aside his will because a bought lawyer with bought witnesses says otherwise, then everything he built means nothing. And I will not allow that." He sat down. The room was silent in the way a room is silent when something true has been said, and everyone present knows it. The commissioner ruled that afternoon. The will of Silas Calloway was valid. The challenge was dismissed. The protective clause stood. The Calloway land would remain in Calloway hands. Cross left without speaking. His lawyer followed. The room emptied slowly, people filing out into the cold November air with the quiet satisfaction of witnesses who had seen something decided rightly. Nolan and Emmett stood outside the town hall. The sun was low and the shadows were long, and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter. Nolan extended his hand. Emmett took it. They did not embrace. They did not apologize. They were not that kind of men, and this was not that kind of moment. It was a handshake between two brothers who had spent 2 years standing on opposite sides of a wound and had finally decided to stand on the same side. The wound was still there. It would be there for a while yet. But they were facing it together now, and that changed everything. "Come home," Nolan said. 2 words, carrying the weight of 2 years. "I will," Emmett said. "Soon." Nolan nodded. He mounted his horse. He rode west without looking back because looking back was not something Calloway men did, and because he trusted for the first time in 2 years that his brother would follow. On a Saturday morning in late November, when the air had gone sharp and clean, and the cottonwoods along the edge of town had dropped the last of their leaves, Emmett asked Clara to walk with him. They walked without destination. His hands were in his coat pockets. Hers were tucked into her sleeves against the cold. When their arms brushed at the edge of a narrow path, neither of them moved apart. "I'd like to show you the ranch," he said after a comfortable stretch of silence. "The South Range, the ridge I told you about." Clara glanced at him. "Show me." "I've been thinking about what it would take to make it a real home again. Not just land." He was looking straight ahead, but there was a careful quality to his voice that she recognized. Emmett Calloway working up to something important, choosing each word the way he chose each stroke when he split wood. Finding the grain, following the line where the thing wanted to come apart. "A home," he paused. "I can't quite picture it without picturing you in it." The cottonwood leaves moved along the path ahead of them, dry and quiet and unhurried. Clara was still for a moment. Then she said, That is either the most practical proposal I've ever heard or the most romantic one. Which would you prefer it to be? She looked at him. This quiet, complicated, entirely decent man who had spent 2 years making himself invisible and had then somehow in a borrowed room in a town he had only passed through by accident, let himself be seen by a woman who had arrived with 12 cents and a broken promise and the stubborn, unreasonable belief that she was meant to belong somewhere. She felt something settle in her chest, warm and certain, without a single trace of the doubt that had followed her off that train platform 3 months ago. Both, she said, at the same time somehow. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and when he reached out and took her hand from her sleeve carefully, as though he understood that some things needed to be held gently in the beginning, she let him. Then both it is, he said. They were married on the 15th of December in the small church at the edge of Sagebrush Crossing. Ruth Brannigan stood as witness wearing a dress Clara had never seen her wear before, and smiling in a way that rearranged her entire face into something younger and softer than the years usually allowed. Mr. Pemberton sat in the second pew quietly pleased in the particular way of a man who understood that some things he had set in motion had led to outcomes better than he had any right to expect. Nolan was there, standing at the back. He did not say much, but he was there and his presence said what his words could not. Della Pruitt brought wildflowers that she had somehow found in November, which was the kind of small miracle that only Della could manage. Boone Hadley sat in the last row and nodded once at Emmett when their eyes met the nod of a man who recognized in another man something worth respecting. The following spring, Clara stood on the ridge. The ridge Emmett had described that first evening on the back porch when the stars were uncertain and the world was still rearranging itself around them, the eastern boundary of the South Range. The place where you could see 4 counties on a clear day. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of morning that makes the world look newly arrived, as though the light had been polishing everything while no one was watching. Emmett stood beside her with his hand resting at the small of her back, and below them the ranch spread out windy and unhurried in every direction. The creek caught the early light in long silver lines through the valley. The grass in the south pasture was still bent from the night's dew, and it moved in the wind like something breathing. It looked, she thought, exactly as he had described it, and it looked like a place where things could last. The first months on the ranch were not easy. They were not meant to wait. The South Range had been neglected for 2 years, and neglect on a ranch does not wait politely to be addressed. Fences needed mending. The well pump had rusted and required replacing. The small house that stood on the property, the original homestead that Emmett's grandfather had built with his own hands 50 years before, needed a new roof and new windows and a door that would close properly against the Wyoming wind. Emmett worked from first light to last. He rose before dawn and moved through the cold morning darkness with the certainty of a man who knew exactly where every fence post stood and every gate hung even after 2 years away. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The particular twist of wire that held a gate closed. The angle at which a post needed to be set to hold firm in the soft ground near the creek. The sound a well pump made when it was working right, a steady rhythm that was more felt than heard like a heartbeat in the ground. Clara worked beside him, not because he asked her to, though he would have asked if she had not offered, because the work was hers too now. The ranch was not something she had married into. It was something she had chosen the way she chose everything, with her eyes open and her hands ready. She learned to ride properly, not the polite trotting she had done as a girl in Missouri, but the real riding of a woman who needs to cover ground between dawn and noon. She learned which grasses the cattle preferred and which ones made them sick. She learned the particular patience required to mend a barbed wire fence without cutting yourself, which was a patience she already possessed from years of sewing, but had never applied to anything that could hurt her back. She planted a kitchen garden beside the house. Tomatoes, beans, herbs that reminded her of her mother's garden in Missouri, sage and thyme, and the particular variety of mint that grew wild along creeks in both territories, as though the plant had decided that water was water, regardless of which side of the mountains it was on. In the evenings after the work was done and the light had gone amber, and then gold, and then the deep quiet blue that Wyoming wore at the end of each day, they sat on the porch that Emmett was building. It was not finished yet. The railing was incomplete, and the steps were temporary planks laid across sawhorses. but the floor was solid and the roof was on, and it faced east toward the morning sun. They sat there and watched the stars come in, and they talked about the day the way people talk who have spent it working side by side. Not recounting events because both had been present for the events, but processing them. Sorting through the small decisions and minor victories and occasional frustrations that make up a day of honest labor, and filing them away in the shared memory of a life being built together. It was during one of those evenings in the late summer of their first year on the ranch that Emmett told her about his father standing on the ridge. "He brought me up there when I was 12, Emmett said. He was looking east where the ridge rose dark against the fading sky. First time I'd ever seen the whole spread at once. I'd been working on it my whole life, but always one fence, one pasture, one creek at a time. I'd never seen the shape of it." He paused. Pa stood there, and he didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said, "Your grandfather had one horse and 60 acres, and no one told him it couldn't be done. That's why it got done, because no one told him otherwise, and he was too stubborn to ask." Clara smiled. "Sounds like someone I know." "Which part, the stubbornness or the not asking, both?" He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved upward. "That familiar place where a smile lived." "Fair enough," he said. Nolan visited once a month. The brothers were not healed. That kind of wound does not heal in months, perhaps not in years. But it was mending the way a fence mends one post at a time, one strand of wire at a time, slowly, and with the kind of effort that only matters if you intend to be there long enough to see it through. And both of them intended to stay. The visits were not comfortable at first. They arrived with the careful formality of two men who had not yet learned how to be brothers again after spending 2 years practicing how to be strangers. Nolan would ride in on a Saturday morning, dismount, tie his horse at the post Emmett had set for exactly that purpose, and stand in the yard for a moment before approaching the house, as though he needed to remind himself each time that he was welcome here, that the invitation was real and not merely polite. They talked about the ranch, about water levels and cattle prices, and the condition of the north fence line after winter. Practical things, safe things, the kind of conversation that two men can have when they are not yet ready for the other kind, but want to be in the same room anyway. Clara served them coffee and left them alone, and she could hear their voices through the kitchen wall, low and measured, finding their way back to a language they had once spoken without thinking. It got easier, not all at once. But by the third visit, Nolan stayed for supper. By the fifth, he helped Emmett repair the corral gate, and they worked side by side in the particular silence of men who are communicating through labor rather than language, which is sometimes the only dialect available when the words have been used up or used wrong. By December of the following year, the ranch house had a new porch. It faced the morning sun the way a man had once promised a woman in a letter full of lies. But the porch was real now, and it had been built by different hands, hands that meant what they made. And in the small room off the kitchen, the room Emmett had spent an entire month building, with the particular determination of a man who understood now fully and without reservation what he was building it for, there was a cradle, handmade, cottonwood cut from the trees along the creek that ran through the south pasture. The child in it had Emmett's dark hair, and Clara's habit of watching everything quietly and carefully, as though the world were a place full of things worth understanding. It was. Nolan came the week the baby was born. He held the child in hands that were too large and too rough and unexpectedly, disarmingly gentle. He stood at the kitchen window with his nephew in his arms and looked out at the land that their father had built and their grandfather had started, and something in his face changed. Not softened exactly, settled. The way a landscape settles after a storm when the clouds pull back and the light returns, and everything is the same but also somehow profoundly different. Emmett watched his brother hold his son. He stood in the doorway with one shoulder against the frame and his arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of a man who had found a good place to stand and saw no reason to move from it. The corner of his mouth moved upward, just slightly, the place where a smile lived when it was not being used. Clara sat at the table and wrote, not a journal entry. She had stopped keeping a journal months ago when her life became something she wanted to live rather than something she needed to record. She was writing a letter. It had a return address on it for the first time in her life. A real address, a place that was hers. She did not know exactly who she was writing to. The world in general, she supposed. Or perhaps to the version of herself who had stood on a train platform 3 months and a lifetime ago, with 12 cents in her pocket and a letter full of lies and no clear idea of what came next. She would have liked to tell that girl something. Not advice exactly, just a fact. A simple, unremarkable, astonishing fact. You will be all right. Not because the world is kind, but because you are stronger than you know, and the place you are meant to find is waiting for you at the end of a road you cannot yet see. And when you get there, you will know it. Not because it is perfect, but because it feels for the first time like something worth staying for. Outside the window, the morning light moved across the valley in long, slow gold. The creek shone silver through the grass. The ridge stood dark against the eastern sky, steady and permanent, and patient the way land is patient, the way it waits for the people who are willing to love it enough to stay. And that is where we leave them, on a ridge at the edge of everything, with the whole wide morning ahead.